Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive. We're going to be exploring the world of C# 13 and .NET 9 today.
Some pretty big releases.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. These updates could really change how we build and use software, so whether you're a developer yourself or just interested in the tech that's kind of behind the scenes of everything we do.
It powers our everyday lives.
Exactly. This is going to be a really fascinating deep dive for you. Our source material today is an article titled C# 13 and .NET 9, Personal Highlights. And it's a fantastic overview of what's new. It does a really good job of explaining what's exciting, what's practical, and most importantly, what it all means for you, the listener.
Yeah, I think it's easy to overlook how fundamental C# and .NET really are.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, they're the foundation for so many apps, like pretty much everything we use daily, from those simple mobile apps to those really complicated systems that businesses rely on.
Yeah, the systems that we don't even see.
Exactly, behind the scenes. So when these platforms get a big update, it really is a pretty big deal.
It has a ripple effect.
Absolutely. And what I really appreciate about this article is how it highlights those changes that make life easier for developers, but also improve the performance of the software itself.
So it's a win-win.
A double win, for sure.
Okay, well, let's jump right in. The article starts by talking about .NET 9 being what they call a standard term support release.
Right.
While .NET 10, which is scheduled for late 2025, will be a long-term support release.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for anyone who's not super deep in software development, what does that actually mean, and why should we care about the difference?
That's a great question. Think of it like long-term support is like that extended warranty you get on your car.
Okay, I like that.
You know it means you're going to get those essential security updates and bug fixes for a much longer time. And that's absolutely critical for large organizations or for systems where stability is non-negotiable.
Mission-critical systems.
Exactly. They can't afford to have downtime. Standard term support, though, is more for those who are okay with a little bit of risk.
The early adopters.
Yes, exactly. They want those newest features right away. They want to be on the cutting edge.
So it's a trade-off, right? You get the latest and greatest, but maybe with a bit less of that long-term stability guarantee.
Yeah, like choosing between a reliable sedan and a sporty new coupe. It just depends what you need.
So if your company's motto is slow and steady wins the race, then maybe hanging back for .NET 10 is the better choice. But if you're like me and you just got to have the newest, shiniest thing.
Well, the article actually gives some pretty compelling reasons to jump on .NET 9 right now.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, like if you're working on a project with a tight deadline, or maybe you're just experimenting with a new idea, in those scenarios, having the latest features can give you a real advantage.
Oh, that makes sense. So it's all about strategically choosing the right tool for the job based on your specific needs and your risk tolerance, right?
Exactly.
Okay, well, we've got the decision plan sorted out. Let's talk about some of the really cool stuff. .NET 9 boasts over 1,000 performance-related changes.
It's a huge number.
I know, I had to read that sentence 3 times when I was prepping for this.
It's not a typo.
No. Over 1,000 changes dedicated to just making things run faster.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm really curious about this. Can you give us some real-world examples of where people will actually see and feel these improvements?
Absolutely. So think about how frustrating it is when, an app takes forever to load or a website just feels laggy. .NET 9 is really targeting those points.
Trying to eliminate those pain points.
Yeah, and one of the key areas is how the system manages memory. And this is thanks to something called an adaptive server garbage collector.
Okay, a garbage collector.
It sounds a little weird.
Yeah, it does.
But it's essentially like a really efficient cleanup crew for your code.
I see.
And make sure everything's running smoothly without wasting any memory.
So it's like decluttering, but for software.
Exactly. So it keeps things tidy, keeps things fast.
Okay, so that's memory. What about the speed at which the code itself actually runs?
Right, so they've also made major improvements to what's called the runtime, and also the JIT compiler, which is the part that translates your code into something the computer can understand.
Okay, so it's like optimizing the engine of a car.
Exactly, a more efficient engine. And this means faster app launches, smoother animations, and faster data processing.
So it's really all about making the user experience snappier, more responsive.
Exactly, just making everything feel faster and smoother.
I'm already excited for this update from my phone. Now, the author of this article also mentions AI integration in .NET 9.
Yeah.
And they even admit that it's not really their area of expertise, and honestly, it's not mine either.
It's a rapidly evolving field.
It is. It's fascinating, though, to see how .NET is starting to really embrace AI. Can you give us like a high-level overview of what that integration looks like and why it matters?
Sure. So .NET 9 is taking a big step towards making AI more accessible to developers, even those who aren't like AI
It's a
specialists.
good thing, right?
Yeah, democratizing AI, making it available to more people. So they're introducing something called unified AI abstractions, which is a fancy way of saying they're creating like a common language for developers to interact with different AI services.
Okay, so instead of having to learn a completely different language for every AI tool out there,
It's like a universal translator for AI.
that makes a lot of sense.
It makes it much easier to incorporate AI capabilities into applications without having to be a specialist in every single AI framework.
Okay, so it's simplifying the process of actually talking to the AI.
Hmm.
Can you give us a tangible example? Like, how would a developer use these AI abstractions in a real application?
Sure. Imagine you're building an app that can analyze images and tell you what objects it sees, kind of like some social media platforms do with automatic photo tagging.
Right.
Now, in the past, this would have required a ton of complex code to interface with a specific image recognition service. But with these new AI abstractions, you could potentially do the same thing with much less code, much less effort.
It's about efficiency.
Exactly. It's abstracting away the complexities and giving developers a more streamlined way to work with AI.
It sounds like .NET 9 is trying to make AI more of a mainstream tool for developers.
It is, and that could open up a whole world of possibilities for building applications that can understand and respond to us in much more intuitive ways.
And that could change so many things.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we get too carried away talking about the AI-powered future,
Yeah.
let's bring it back down to earth for a minute. Let's talk about something that affects, well, all of us every single day.
Okay.
Web development.
Yes.
The article talks about some significant love for ASP.NET Core in this release. So for anyone listening who's not a web developer, can you just break down what ASP.NET Core is and why it matters and what's got web developers so excited about these updates?
Absolutely. So ASP.NET Core is like the go-to framework for building web applications with .NET. It powers a lot of the websites and web services we use every day.
It's behind the scenes of a lot of what we do online.
Yeah, exactly. And in .NET 9, they've really focused on performance. They've made a ton of under-the-hood optimizations that result in much faster response times and better scalability.
So that means websites will load faster, online forms will submit quicker. Basically, web applications will just feel snappier overall.
Exactly. It's about making the user experience as smooth and responsive as possible.
Okay, so as someone who's definitely not a web developer, even I know that speed is everything when it comes to websites. No one likes waiting for a page to load.
Absolutely. Patience is wearing thin these days.
It is. Now, the article also mentions something about optimized handling of static files. That sounds kind of, well, a little bit boring. But I have a feeling there's a reason why web developers are excited about this.
Oh, there definitely is.
Can you explain?
So static files might sound a little dry, but they're actually the backbone of a website's look and feel. Think images, CSS style sheets, JavaScript files.
All the stuff that makes a website look good and work properly.
Exactly. And by optimizing how those files are handled, websites can load significantly faster. So it really does make a difference.
So it's all about the behind-the-scenes tweaks that make a big difference for us, the end users.
Exactly. Sometimes the smallest changes have the biggest impact.
Okay, so we've got speed, smoother user experience. What else is new in the web development world with .NET 9? Anything that's going to really change how we build websites or how we interact with them in the future?
So they've also made some pretty exciting improvements to Blazor,
Blazor.
which is a framework for building interactive web UIs using C#.
Okay.
Think of it like a way to create those dynamic, responsive web pages, but without relying as heavily on JavaScript.
Interesting.
So Blazor lets developers use their existing C# skills, which is a big advantage. And with .NET 9, it's gotten even better. New features, better performance, especially the way it handles reconnections. So it's definitely a more compelling choice now.
Blazor sounds intriguing. We might have to do a whole other deep dive on just that sometime.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there.
But for now, let's switch gears and talk about C# 13.
Okay.
The author of this article seems pretty excited about how the new features in C# 13 make code what they call cleaner and more intuitive. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
Absolutely. C# 13 is really all about making things easier for developers and helping them write more elegant, efficient code.
Less is more.
In a way, yes. And, when developers can write better code, it ultimately leads to better software for everyone.
Okay, well, let's get into specifics then.
Yeah.
One of the features that caught my eye was something called params collections. The explanation in the article was a little technical for me. Can you break it down for us? Like, explain it in a way that even I can understand.
Sure. So imagine you're building a tool that needs to be flexible in terms of how much information it receives.
Okay.
Sometimes you might give it one piece of data, sometimes a whole bunch of data, sometimes maybe even no data at all.
So it needs to be adaptable.
Yes, exactly. Now, in the past, C# made it a bit tricky to write code that could handle all those different scenarios gracefully. But params collections come in and give developers a much easier way to write code that can just adapt to different amounts of input.
So it's like giving developers a more versatile tool.
Right.
Something that can handle a wider range of situations.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes sense. The article also mentions something called a new lock object. Something about asynchronous code and deadlocks. I'm afraid that went over my head a little bit. Can you maybe demystify that one for us?
Sure. Imagine you have a shared resource, like a file that multiple people need to access at the same time.
Okay, shared access.
Right. Now, in programming, that can cause chaos if everyone's trying to make changes simultaneously. So the lock keyword is like putting a virtual lock on that resource. It makes sure only one part of the code can access it at a time, so it prevents conflicts and errors.
So it's like a traffic light system.
Yes, exactly. Keeps everything flowing smoothly and prevents those digital collisions.
Well, what's new about this new lock object?
So in the past, using lock with what we call asynchronous code, which is code that can run in the background without blocking everything else.
It gets a little complicated.
Yeah, it gets tricky. It was like navigating a minefield. You could easily run into what are called deadlocks, where everything just freezes because different parts of the code are stuck waiting for each other.
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
Not good at all. This new lock object provides a much safer and more reliable way to use lock with asynchronous code. It prevents those deadlocks and makes life much easier for developers.
So it's like they've upgraded the traffic management system.
Yes, exactly. Handles those more complex scenarios.
Okay, I can see how that would be a huge help. Now, the article mentions multi-threaded logging as a specific example of where this would be helpful. Can you give us a more, relatable, real-world scenario where this would come into play?
Sure. Imagine you're building an online video game where you have multiple players interacting with each other at the same time.
So a very dynamic environment.
Yes, a lot going on simultaneously. You wouldn't want their actions to get all jumbled up or cause the game to freeze because multiple threads are trying to access the same game data at the same time. This new lock object helps make sure everything happens in the right order so the gaming experience is much smoother.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense to me. I can actually picture that. Now, there's another C#13 feature that caught my eye, and this one, the article actually does a pretty good job of explaining using a real-world example. It's called implicit index access, and it uses that little caret symbol, which looks like this. Let me see if I can explain it the way the article does.
Go ahead. I'm curious to hear your take.
All right, so imagine you have what's called an array, which is basically like a list of items. And let's say this array represents a scoreboard, right?
Okay, I can visualize that.
You've got a bunch of players, and there are schools. Now, let's say you want to display the rankings in reverse order. So you want to start with the last player on the list.
Okay, starting from the bottom and going up.
Exactly. Now, in the past, you would have had to write some extra code to access those elements from the end of the list. But with this new feature, you can just use the symbol directly to say, hey, give me the last element or give me the second to last element and so on. It's like a shortcut that makes the code much cleaner and easier to read.
That's a perfect explanation, and it really highlights one of the main goals of C#13, which is to make the code more concise and intuitive. It's about reducing the amount of boilerplate code that developers have to write and letting them focus on the actual logic and the functionality of their applications.
So it's about getting rid of the unnecessary clutter and making the code more elegant and efficient.
Exactly. It's like streamlining the whole process.
Okay, so far we've covered some pretty impressive improvements in both .NET 9 and C#13. But honestly, we've just scratched the surface.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot more.
There's so much more to unpack, and we'll be back in part 2 to dive even deeper into these exciting new releases.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to discover, so stay tuned.
And we're back for part 2 of our deep dive into C#13 and .NET 9. We're picking up right where we left off, still exploring those cool new features and improvements that have everyone talking. It's fascinating, to see just how much effort goes into making software better. And not just for the folks that actually build it, but for everyone who uses it too.
I think that's really important. These aren't just like superficial changes. These updates are tackling some really challenging issues, and I think they're really laying the foundation for a much more, well, a more efficient future for software, a more powerful future, and a more user-friendly one too.
Right, exactly. It's about making the entire software landscape better. Okay, before we move on, I wanted to circle back to C# 13 for a second. We talked about params collections and how they really streamline the code, how they can handle different amounts of input. Less workarounds, more elegance.
Right.
Definitely a win for developers. But are there any other C# 13 features that really stand out to you as being particularly impactful?
There are a few. One that I think is really interesting is the expanded use of the params keyword. They've expanded it to work with a lot of different collection types, and in earlier versions of C#, using params was a little bit more restricted, so this is a really nice improvement. It might seem like a small tweak, but it's one of those things that developers are going to really appreciate because it just lets them write cleaner, more expressive code.
It's all about making the code more, well, elegant, right? Like the difference between writing a clunky sentence and one that just flows beautifully.
Exactly.
Speaking of elegance, I remember you mentioning how C# 13 really emphasizes code readability. Why is that so important, especially when you've got a bunch of developers working together on a project?
Well, imagine you're working on a huge software project, right? A big team of developers, everyone's contributing code, building on each other's work, and now imagine you're trying to understand someone else's code that's poorly written or inconsistent or just really difficult to follow.
Yeah, it'd be a nightmare.
It would be a nightmare. And that's why code readability is so crucial. It's not just about making it look pretty, it's about making sure that the code is easy to understand, easy to maintain, and easy to collaborate on. CR14 introduces these features that encourage good coding practices, and that makes it so much easier for everyone to work together and build better software.
It's like trying to assemble furniture with a poorly written instruction manual, as opposed to one that's clear, concise, and maybe even has some helpful diagrams.
Exactly. The right instructions can make all the difference.
Absolutely. So C# 13 is all about empowering developers to write better code. Now, let's shift gears for a bit and delve a little deeper into those performance enhancements in .NET 9. I know the article mentioned over 1,000 changes, but it didn't really go into detail about all of them.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit more about where these performance improvements will be most noticeable?
Sure. I mean, they've really made optimizations across the board, from how the system manages memory to how quickly your code actually executes. One area that I think deserves a special mention is garbage collection. .NET 9 introduces this new garbage collector. It's called the Adaptive Server Garbage Collector, and it's incredibly efficient. It's like having a really smart cleanup crew that knows exactly when and how to tidy up your code's memory usage without causing any slowdowns or interruptions.
So it's like having a self-cleaning oven, but for your code.
Exactly. Less mess, less hassle, everything just runs smoother.
I like that analogy. But what about the speed at which the code itself actually runs? Have they made improvements there too?
Oh, absolutely. They've enhanced what's called the runtime, which is where your code actually executes, and also the JIT compiler, which translates your code into instructions the computer can understand. And all these enhancements mean that your code will run faster, more efficiently. And for the user, that means faster app startups, smoother animations, faster data processing.
So it's like they've given our software a performance tune-up.
Exactly. Everything's just running smoother, faster.
That makes everyone happy.
I think so.
Now, shifting gears again, remember how we talked about AI integration in .NET 9? You mentioned it's still early days, but it's clear that Microsoft is really serious about making AI more accessible to developers. What do you think are some of the potential implications of this? Like, what types of applications might we see in the future because of this?
That's a great question. It's one that has me really excited about the future of software. Because as AI becomes more tightly integrated into platforms like .NET, we're going to see this surge in intelligent applications, applications that can learn and adapt and interact with us in all sorts of new ways.
So give us an example. What would these AI-powered applications look like? Like, paint a picture for us.
Okay, well, imagine a world where your email client can not only filter out spam, but can also prioritize your messages based on how important they are. And it can automatically schedule meetings for you. And it can even suggest responses to emails based on what you've written in the past or the content of the email you're replying to.
Wow.
Or picture a healthcare app that can analyze your medical history and track your symptoms and provide personalized recommendations for managing your health.
That would be amazing.
And these are just a couple of examples. The possibilities really are endless. As AI becomes more deeply woven into the fabric of software development, I think we're going to see some really incredible things.
Yeah, it feels like we're on the cusp of a whole new era of software. Like instead of just being tools, applications will become more like partners, you know? Partners that can help us navigate this increasingly complex world we live in.
I totally agree. It's exciting and a little bit daunting at the same time, but it's definitely an exciting time to be following this technology.
It is. It really is. Okay, let's bring our focus back to web development for a moment. We talked about all the performance improvements in ASP.NET Core,
Right.
but what are some of the other notable changes in .NET 9 that web developers should be aware of?
Well, one area where they've made significant improvements is in how what are called APIs are handled.
APIs.
Yeah, APIs, which stands for Application Programming Interfaces. And they're essentially like the messengers of the web.
Okay,
They allow different applications to communicate with each other.
I see.
And with .NET 9, it's become much easier, more secure, and more efficient to both build and consume these APIs.
Hmm.
They've also introduced something called minimal APIs.
Minimal APIs.
Yeah, which is kind of a lightweight, streamlined approach to building APIs, and this is especially useful for what are called microservices architectures, where you have applications that are broken down into smaller, independent services that all need to talk to each other.
So it's like streamlining the language of the web, so to speak.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, making it much easier for different applications to talk to each other.
But why is this important for the average person? Someone who's not a developer.
Well, think about all the different applications and services that you use every day, right? Social media, online shopping, banking, streaming services. A lot of these rely on APIs to exchange data and functionality. And so the improvements in .NET 9 make those interactions smoother and faster and more secure, and that ultimately leads to a better experience for you. Imagine a world where you can switch seamlessly between different apps. You can share data effortlessly. It's all about creating a more integrated and more personalized online experience.
So it's all about creating a more connected and streamlined digital world. I'm starting to see how these updates, even though they sound very technical, they really have this ripple effect that extends far beyond the world of just developers.
Absolutely. And we haven't even talked about Blazor yet.
Oh, right. Blazor. That's the framework for building web UIs with C#.
Mm-hmm.
We mentioned it briefly before, but I'm still curious about it. What's so special about it? Like, why is it gaining so much traction in the web development world?
Blazor's interesting because it allows developers to use their existing C# skills to build these rich, interactive web UIs without having to learn a whole new language like JavaScript.
So they can stick with what they know.
Exactly, and that's a huge advantage, especially for developers who are already comfortable with C#. It makes the learning curve a lot less steep, and it lets them build web applications more efficiently.
So it's like being able to speak your native language when you travel to a foreign country.
Exactly. Makes the whole experience so much easier.
Absolutely. But what about performance? Can Blazor applications keep up with the traditional JavaScript-based web apps that we're all used to?
That was a concern initially,
Okay.
but with .NET 9, they've made significant progress in improving the performance of Blazor applications. They've introduced these new techniques for optimizing rendering and how data is transferred, so it's definitely become a more compelling choice.
It sounds like it. It sounds like Blazor is becoming a serious contender in the web development space.
It is. It's got these unique capabilities, and the .NET team keeps making improvements, so I think we're going to see Blazor adopted by more and more companies in the coming years.
That's pretty exciting. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've talked about performance enhancements, AI integration, API improvements, and the rise of Blazor.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's clear that both C# 13 and .NET 9 are packed with these really interesting new features and improvements, and it feels like these are the types of changes that will really shape the future of software development.
I think you're right. And before we move on to part 3, I just want to leave our listeners with a thought. These updates, they aren't just about making software better for developers. They're about making software better for everyone.
I like that.
Creating a more efficient, more powerful, and a more user-friendly digital world.
That's a great point. It's easy to get lost in the technical details, but at the end of the day, it's all about how these changes benefit us, the users, right?
Absolutely, and that's what makes this such an exciting time to be following this technology. We're seeing this shift in how software is being built and how it's interacting with our lives.
We are. We're living in the future. Well, join us for part 3. where we'll wrap up our deep dive into C# 13 and .NET 9. We'll be examining how these updates impact the overall developer experience and what that means for the future of software. See you there. And welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into the world of C# 13 and .NET 9. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've talked about all these performance boosts, AI integrations, the evolution of web development. It's been a whirlwind. But before we wrap up, I'd love to shift our focus to, well, the unsung heroes of the software world.
You mean the developers?
The developers, exactly.
Yeah.
We've spent a lot of time talking about how all these updates benefit end users, like you and me.
Right, the people actually using the software.
But at the heart of all this, there are these incredibly talented developers who are actually writing the code, building these applications, and making all this magic happen.
They're the ones who really make it all work.
They are. And they're the ones who have to grapple with all this complexity day in and day out. So I'm really curious, how do C# 13 and .NET 9 actually impact the developer experience?
That's a great question.
Like, what are the biggest takeaways for the people who are actually building the software with these tools?
Well, I think one of the overarching themes we've seen throughout this whole deep dive is this emphasis on simplicity and clarity.
Okay, so less is more.
In a way, yeah. Both C# 13 and .NET 9 are packed with features and improvements that streamline the development process. They reduce the amount of just tedious boilerplate code that developers have to write, and that makes it easier to create software that's not only robust and reliable, but also easier to maintain in the long run.
Right, because software always needs updates.
Always.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. We talked about params collections in C# 13 and how they make it easier to handle all those different types of input, right? Fewer workarounds, more elegant code. That's definitely a win for developers. But there's got to be more. What other features are making developers' lives easier?
Yeah, well, one thing that really stands out to me is the focus on improving code readability. Imagine you're a developer, you're working on this massive code base, and you have to dive into a section of code that someone else wrote.
Right, trying to decipher it.
And if that code is messy, if it's inconsistent, if it's just hard to follow, it can be a really frustrating and time-consuming experience.
Yeah, you can imagine.
So C# 13 introduces these features that encourage better coding practices.
Like guidelines.
Yeah, like guidelines. And that just makes the code more intuitive, easier to understand. Like, for example, the use of the operator for implicit index access.
Right. We talked about that.
It makes the code more readable, right?
It does. It's like the difference between reading a well-written article and one that's full of jargon and confusing sentences.
Exactly. Good code should be like good writing.
I like that. Clear, concise, easy to digest.
And readable code is not just about aesthetics. It's about reducing errors. It's about making it easier for teams to collaborate. And it makes the software much easier to maintain and update down the line.
So it's a win for everyone.
It is.
Okay, now another thing that I'm always curious about when it comes to developer experience is tooling.
Yeah, the tools of the trade.
Exactly. Good tools can make a huge difference in a developer's productivity and, honestly, in how much they enjoy their work.
Oh, absolutely. The right tools can be a game changer.
They can. What's new in .NET 9 that's making developers' lives better when it comes to tooling?
Well, they've made significant improvements to what's called the .NET SDK.
The SDK.
Which is the set of tools that developers use to build, test, and deploy their applications. They've also enhanced the debugging and profiling tools.
Which are essential, right?
No, absolutely essential for finding and fixing all those little bugs that inevitably creep into any complex software project.
Because they're always bugs.
Always. It's impossible to avoid them completely.
Right. So it's kind of like, if you think about a chef, you're giving them a set of high-quality knives, a powerful mixer, an oven that heats evenly.
Right.
The right tools can make all the difference in the quality of the final product.
Absolutely. And they've also really focused on improving the documentation, which might seem like a small thing.
Oh, but documentation is huge.
Huge. It's so crucial. Clear, concise, up-to-date documentation can save developers so much time and frustration.
It's like having a good map when you're exploring a new city, right?
Yeah.
It can make the whole journey so much smoother and more enjoyable.
It really can.
Okay, so it sounds like .NET 9 is really putting developers first, giving them the tools and the resources they need to do their best work.
It is. It's about empowering developers, creating an environment where they can be creative and innovative.
Right, because ultimately that leads to better software for all of us, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I want to go back to AI integration one last time. We've talked about how it's making AI more accessible to developers. But I'm curious about your take on this.
Mm.
How do you think AI will impact the role of developers in the future? Like, will AI eventually replace human developers altogether?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is?
The million-dollar question. And it's definitely sparking a lot of debate. There's no doubt that AI is already changing how software is built.
Or it's happening now.
We're seeing AI-powered tools that can automate those repetitive tasks, generate code, even help with debugging.
So it's like having an AI assistant working alongside developers, making them more efficient, more productive.
Yeah.
But could it ever completely replace them?
Well, while AI is incredibly powerful, I think human creativity and ingenuity and those problem-solving skills, those are always going to be essential in software development. Building software is not just about writing code. It's about understanding human needs, designing intuitive interfaces, solving complex problems.
It's about understanding the bigger picture, right?
It is. It's about the why behind the what. And I think those are things that AI, at least for now, isn't quite equipped to handle.
Right. It's like the difference between a machine that can generate text and a human writer who can actually craft a compelling story, a story that resonates with people on an emotional level.
Exactly. AI can be this incredible tool, but ultimately it's humans who need to guide its development. We need to make sure it's being used ethically, and we need to harness its potential to create software that really benefits humanity.
It sounds like it's going to be this fascinating partnership between humans and machines, each bringing their own unique strengths to the table.
I think that's a great way to look at it. And as AI continues to evolve, I'm really excited to see how this partnership unfolds. I think we're going to see some truly amazing innovations come out of this collaboration.
Me too. It's exciting. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored all the exciting new features in C# 13 and .NET 9. We've talked about performance, web development, AI integration. We've even touched on the future of software development in this world that's becoming more and more AI-powered. It's been quite a journey.
It has a journey of discovery, and I hope our listeners have gained a better understanding of these new technologies and how they're shaping the world around us.
I know I have. And I have to say, I'm walking away from this deep dive feeling pretty optimistic about the future of software.
Me too.
It feels like we're on the right track, building tools that empower developers, create better experiences for users, and open up all these new possibilities for innovation.
I agree. I think the future looks bright, and I encourage all our listeners to stay curious, keep exploring, and see how you can use these technologies to make a positive impact on the world.
That's a fantastic message. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of C# 13 and .NET 9. Until next time, keep on coding, keep on learning, and keep on diving deep.